Good evening. Tonight, we're dissecting a critical report from NPR examining U.S. policy in Gaza and its impact on the escalating humanitarian crisis. Sources, including over 24 former senior U.S. officials from the Biden administration, reveal a complex and often frustrating internal debate. While senior officials engaged in intense diplomatic efforts with Israel to increase aid delivery, frustration mounted over perceived Israeli obstruction. These officials described sharp disagreements within the administration, pitting those who advocated for leveraging U.S. influence to enforce international humanitarian law and aid access against those who favored behind-the-scenes pressure. The looming specter of famine in Gaza, now confirmed by leading food security authorities, has led many former officials to question if their efforts were sufficient. "We didn't do enough," is a recurring sentiment, with some acknowledging the administration's inability to mobilize a consistently adequate response. Senator Chris Van Hollen echoed these concerns, criticizing the administration's approach as feckless in holding the Netanyahu government to standards applied to other nations. The article traces the origins of the crisis back to the war's initial days, noting a reluctance within the early U.S. response to elevate humanitarian issues, with the posture being that the U.S. would not manage Israel's war. Internal discussions were often hampered by a sense of Israeli trauma and retribution following the October 7th attacks. A significant missed opportunity, according to former State Department official Andrew Miller, was the failure to agree with Israel on the contours of the war, encompassing both military operations and the provision for Palestinian civilians. These efforts were further complicated by Israeli political realities, with Prime Minister Netanyahu reportedly citing immense domestic pressure against allowing aid. The persistent Israeli assertion that aid limitations were to prevent Hamas theft, despite evidence to the contrary, became a recurring hurdle in discussions. The administration found itself bogged down in the details, negotiating truck by truck, a process one official described as exhausting their leverage and taking them out of the larger humanitarian crisis picture. The sheer volume of high-level calls, including from President Biden himself, to negotiate aid truck numbers highlighted the administrative strain. President Biden's deep-seated personal commitment to Israel, described as moral and intrinsic, heavily influenced the administration's approach, leading to a reluctance to apply stronger political pressure, even amidst the growing humanitarian catastrophe. Some former officials deemed this stance morally bankrupt, arguing for a more robust defense of Palestinian rights to assistance. As the situation deteriorated, the U.S. resorted to measures like airdrops and the construction of a temporary pier, which officials acknowledged as inefficient and costly alternatives to effective land routes. Critics labeled these as fundamental distractions from the core needs. The debate continues between those who believe these workarounds were the only politically viable options, and those who argue that withholding military assistance was the strongest, yet unused, tool. Congressional pressure, notably from Senator Van Hollen, contributed to the creation of National Security Memorandum 20, requiring a report on Israel's compliance with humanitarian aid obligations. However, the report's findings were later described as opaque and watered down by some, failing to fully hold the Netanyahu government accountable. A brief pause on weapon shipments in response to concerns about an operation in Rafah was also seen by some as insufficient and undercut by the U.S. referring to it as a pause rather than a halt. Ultimately, many former officials and aid groups contend that, while the Biden administration attempted to assist, it failed to establish clear red lines for civilian protection, compromising America's global standing. The article concludes by noting the current administration's shift in policy and a significant worsening of the humanitarian situation in Gaza since. We'll continue to follow this developing story. If you like our content, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel News Today.